Hi, everyone. Thank you for checking in at the Inner Game of Change podcast, where we focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change effectively. My guests cover a diverse number of critical topics to enable change adoption, including communication, leadership, training, change practice, process design, change capability, and much more. My name is Ali Juma. Today I'm joined by the global change leadership expert, Dr. Jen Frahm, to chat about her book, Change.Leader. In this book, Jen takes us through 33 leadership areas for any change leader to reflect and act on to lead better. Each chapter has a series of change actions to help measure the progress. Written in a conversational style, Jen's book offers a pragmatic guidance and things you can do to be a better change leader. I'm grateful to have Dr. Jen Frahm chatting to me today. So, Jen, thank you so much for joining the Inner Game of Change podcast. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, Ali. Really excited to have a bit of a chat with you, a bit of a conversation.
Fantastic. And you're very good at conversations because you've got quite a few conversation frameworks, I think. Today, I want to talk a lot about your book, Change.Leader. And I put the dot in there because I think there's intention behind it. And really curious about what you want to share with us. And also, I encourage anybody who is listening to this to actually get hold of the book. It is the latest book in Australia about change management, coming from well-established, experienced thought leader. And I'm really grateful to have you here. So, Jen, the book has got, I think, 65 change actions, and I think it's got about 33 topics.
Mm-hmm.
Did you enjoy writing it, Jen?
Did I enjoy? Oh, that's such a good question. Did I enjoy writing it? I think the answer is yes. And I say I think because often for me, writing is a compulsion. And so it's something that I have to get out. And for me, a lot of the times writing is me actually thinking through concepts and ideas. And so writing is a vehicle for actually building my knowledge and thinking. But it's also a vehicle for connection, for me to be actually able to say to the audience, I see you, I have heard you. You know, I may not understand, but I get what you are telling me, and these are my thoughts on it. And so to that extent, it is enjoyable. I am very fortunate that I write really fast compared to a lot of people. And with that, it means that I can often get very lost in the writing because, you know, it is this flow moment,
yes,
you know. It's literally one of those deep work exercises for me. Yeah.
Writing is a manifestation of, well, it's actually an attempt to articulate thoughts. And in that process, then you hope you're going to reach to a destination. And interesting. Yeah, it's and on writing, I think, and I'm talking from experience from my postgraduate years and now, it forces you to actually validate your thoughts as well. You become responsible about the word.
Well, and you become accountable. Right? Yes. You become accountable for what you're putting out there. I think the interesting space to explore for me is really this space between the unfinished thinking and being courageous enough to publish something that is unfinished thinking. Because I find that when you work an idea and you work it and you work it and you work it, to get it to a point where you think that it's, you know, perfect and it's nobody can argue with it and et cetera, you actually lose the power of it. The power of a lot of the written word is what's not said or what's undone in it.
Yes,
the gaps. Is something I've always, and I think that's something I've always tried to bring into my writing. Is that side of it. Giving space for the reader to actually join in a conversation, that it is written in a conversational tone rather than a definitive, this is the way kind of thing. Or at least that's my intent.
Absolutely, and I loved it. As I mentioned to you just before, I read it twice because I'm a slow reader, so I read slowly and I digest it. And sometimes I actually don't finish because I'm excited about what I'm going to go into. So I don't want to, it's like a nice meal, but I don't want to eat it all very quickly. Talk to me about the title. It is change.leader. Is that an intention of, persuading the audience that action is intended here?
Well, it was very intentional, and it was intentional because where I'd got to over a period of years was recognizing that for change leaders to be effective, they actually have to change themselves first. In supporting leaders in organizations who typically were business sponsors or someone who was, expected to be leading change, they often had a fair bit of work to do themselves first to be able to be effective at leading that change. And so one day I was just looking at the word change leader, and it came to me, it was like, actually, this is an instruction, not a title. And if we just move the punctuation in it, that word change leader changes. It tells a very different story in terms of there is an urgency to leadership now. You actually have to change if you want to be effective at leading through continuing disruptive times.
Yes.
And so I think, so that was the intention behind it.
So who is it written for, Jen?
So my audience that was who was sitting next to me as I was writing it really were organizational leaders. So those people who are in usually more senior roles, not necessarily with a change background, but typically the type of people that might be sponsors of a project, they might be in the C-suite, they might be in the senior levels of leadership, that people are looking to them for guidance on what is the way forward. Now, with that, that also does speak to those people who work in change, because often the people who work in change are considered leaders of change, by virtue of their knowledge and expertise. But initially it was a very small audience. It was the formal leaders in organizations. I've since, had conversations with people who are more in team leader roles, and they've really got a lot of value out of it as well. So I guess that's really challenged my assumptions around where there is value in it. So
sorry, you go, Jen.
I was just going to say, I think if you're leading a group of people, so whether that be a team or whether that's a community, whether that's a sporting team, there's probably messages in this book for you by virtue of that's what you need to do.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of content in there that anybody in a leadership role can actually pick up. So not necessarily about change. So you talked about even things like curiosity, doing, a stock take of your capabilities. I mean, they're all leadership qualities that you want to, keep an eye on if you really want to grow. So you also touch on the mindset. But you started the book with the maxim, know thyself. And I've studied this, and it's taken me really back to my study years. And at the time, it probably took me about 30 years to even get close to what that even means, let alone actually act on it. First of all, why is it important to start with oneself?
I think where I was going with that, initially the phrase that was jumping out for me was physician, heal thyself, right? And I thought there was a parallel meaning there in the sense of these people we call change leaders who take accountability and ownership of leading change and telling other people to change actually need to start with themselves first. And to start with yourself, you actually have to do a really tough introspective piece of work that it is, it really is the attempt. I'm going to say the attempt because I'm not sure that any of us ever really, really know ourselves, right? I think there is always a domain that is unknown to ourselves.
Of course, yes.
But it's the intent to be introspective and look within to understand, if I have to change personally to go forward, where is it that I have to change? And so part of that is, where are my strengths? What is my emotional capability? What is my psychological structure at the moment to be able to be a leader of continuing change? There's been some really great examples, Ali, that we have seen over the last 12 months. And this is kind of where the book came from, right? I had started the book 2 years ago, and it was a bit different. And then Brené Brown published Dare to Lead. And I was like, bugger it, the book's not there anymore. She's just written the book that I thought I was writing. And so I shelved it. And then I was having a conversation in about October last year with one of my clients and past directors of programs. And she's out consulting to the C-suite. And she said, look, we're all doing it so tough. You know, they're just so not equipped at the moment. They're not equipped to be dealing with the trauma that everybody is going through. And it was a conversation out of that where some of the things I was sharing with her, and she was like, oh, we need to find a way to scale this conversation that we're having. Because what you're telling me, I need to go back and now tell a lot of my clients. And that was really where it came from, was recognizing that in the face of what was incredible, painful disruption of 2020 and pretty amazing opportunities, most leaders were caught napping. They were really unprepared for that moment. And that's why they had to start with themselves to understand what it is that they had to look at themselves personally to change before they could start to be effective in other domains.
And the idea, I think, when you start with yourself, this is an attempt to have an empathy when you talk to your own followers, because you would have done it yourself. You would have understood some of the challenges, because, as you mentioned, first of all, it's damn hard to know oneself. And the second thing is really hard as well to sit and objectively somehow take a stock, because we are a bunch of biases, and there's an ego, and there's quite a few things, and we over-exaggerate our capabilities anyway. And so it is hard. Actually, now I started thinking about it a little bit. I think there were 3 maxims. One is know thyself, which I think the translation is actually know thy measure. And the second one was something around, this was on the temple in Delphi. Know thyself. Something around abundance or excess is bad. But there was one that now you made me think about. It's called surety brings ruin. And it actually talks about that sometimes too much certainty is a bad thing. And so the unknown sometimes is actually quite more exciting than the known. And I think you covered that on the unknown has got a lot of potential.
Oh, I wish I'd known that, Ali. That would have been an amazing chapter title.
I'm just going back now. I'm actually thinking about it. I'm just going back. And I couldn't understand it at the time, because now you made me think about it. Because at the time I was trying to understand, surely certainty is a good thing. And but what would I know?
Certainty is an illusion, isn't it?
I know. Yeah, you're right.
Certainty is so illusionary that we could possibly have certainty.
Yes.
And yet we cling to it.
Yes.
You know, it's the last lifeboat.
Yeah. You talk to me about resilience, and I think, is it resilience, because there's a lot of talk about it now, as if it's actually something new, but it's not. Is it a mindset, or is it a learned behavior?
Oh, you ask all the hard questions.
Can we actually teach it easily to people? Can we build it, or is it?
I definitely think you can build resilience, and we can teach practices that encourage resilience. So I think that we can make progress from a resilience perspective in many areas, professionally and personally. I don't think resilience is the holy grail, though, right? And I think we get a little bit carried away, and I say we here as an industry, as a professional domain, we get a little bit carried away with the notion of if we could just make people be a little bit more resilient, they'd be better with change. Instead of saying, actually, let's look at the factors around us that might be creating a dip or a decline in resilience. I think there's a false heroic around the narrative and the discourse that we have around resilience. And if you look at resilience in other fields, in engineering, it tells us a very different story around why we want resilience. And it's that ability to be flexible. But at some point, even a resilient building will collapse. And I just feel like I'm having trouble articulating what it is. I'm quite uncomfortable with the discourse that we've got about resilience at the moment.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think the idea is that this is why I asked the question, because I've been reading a lot about it. And it doesn't come overnight. In fact, if you want to see really a reflection of resilience, you want to look at the sports world, industries like the army, and there's quite a lot of discipline required associated with resilience. However, I think I don't mind the discourse. I don't mind the discussion about it, because I am uncomfortable of organizations keep talking about change fatigue. And I think I had this conversation with Lena Ross as well, is that how do we shift that mindset of weakness to building strength? Because there are two different ways of looking at things.
Yeah, and change resilience is often talked about in positive psychology as change muscles, right? How do we build change muscles? And again, Lena and I differ on change fatigue. We've had some really good argumentative discussions with each other and debates over it. So I think change fatigue is real. And I think, yes, we can reframe it, and yes, we can shift our focus to other areas, and that is wise to do. But we also need to heed a fatigued workforce, because we are either doing too much change, or too much change that's not supported well, or too much change that is not designed well. And so if we take a step back, what are the things that we are doing that are contributing to a fatigued workforce, as opposed to how do we make the workforce stronger so they can bear the rubbish that we're going to put on them?
Yeah, look, I mean, both approaches can work, and it depends where the organization is at. I think if the organization is resilient or shows a lot of signs of resilience, you can make it stronger. Yeah. I think if it's fatigue is a real thing, and I agree, but it's a problem that is wanting a solution. I was going to say, in the book I talk about, the power of self-compassion, and I think this comes into play with the conversation of resilience, because I think sometimes resilience is confused with stoicism, and that buckle up, brace, armor on. Completely different, two different things.
Yeah, whereas if we actually look at self-compassion as a really important part of resilience, the ability to collapse and be comfortable with the fact that you're collapsing, and to give yourself that space. That's really all you ask for.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. What's the name of your cat?
Aren't we lucky that we're not showing the video of this? My cat is Audrey Autumn, and she has decided I've done way too much time at the computer, and she would like some special attention.
She is looking at you, and just face to face, looking through the eyes. Let's talk about which is probably a segue to I think you mentioned, which I quite like and made me think about it, the concept of the new power versus the old power. From power over to power to and power with. Do you want to share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I think this is going to be one of the most difficult changes that leaders have to make. And we have thousands of years of systems of domination, right? And so to move from this system of domination, which is power, that you achieve what you need to achieve by wielding power over people. Yeah. That there are winners and losers, which, again, if you look at a lot of strategy in organisational life, it's born of power over. And this notion of moving to what is a newer form of power, so power with or power to. And so the examples that I use in the book, we've got Hyman and Timms with their book New Power, but also Brené Brown talks about it. And I was reading somewhere the other day that the initial power with came from Mary Follett's work back in the 1800s. So one of our very first theorists in organisational development, human relations, was the first one to actually come up with that concept, and has never really been credited with it, or it's carried forward. So I'm looking forward to doing a bit more research on that, so that I can look at where it came from, because when I was doing the research for the book, I couldn't find much more other than what we were seeing with Hyman and Timms. And
that's probably a validation that all thoughts are recycled thoughts.
I was going to say, I don't kid myself, Ali.
Well, it's they are recycled, but the context is different, and the way of looking at them is different as well. So I think my father mentioned to me one day that, and he disheartened me because I thought I was creative, and he said something like, "Nothing is new under the sun." I couldn't understand it at the time, but it's proven again and again that it's just recycled thoughts. But the admirable thing about it is that every time you recycle it, you uncover new meaning to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that saying of build knowledge by standing on the shoulder of giants.
Yes.
And a lot of this was the reason why I left academia. So I was an academic for a period of time, and I was increasingly uncomfortable with the way knowledge is built. And in academia, knowledge is often built by knocking other people down and tearing down their work rather than the building on. Yeah. And, that was one of the reasons why I really enjoy the community that's out there that are publishing their work and sharing their thoughts and, hosting podcasts and things like that, because it is really a much more constructive way of building knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. A shared knowledge distributed power brings up possibilities and then new ways of thinking and looking at things. You mentioned a big thing in your book, which is about trust. Yep. Again, you really tackled all the big things, and building trust needs time, as we all know. So we are going through uncertain times, and we don't have a lot of time. We've got distributed workforces now. We all majority of us work remotely. How is building trust now? First of all, is trust now different from before the pandemic? And do we need to take a different look at trust now?
I don't think that trust is different pre and now with the pandemic. I do think that perhaps what's changed for people is the way that they would have validated, is somebody trustworthy? So prior to the pandemic, when you've got people all working in the workforce together, you've got a lot more eye contact. You don't have this mediation by screen and by technology, which allows you to have a much greater sense of connection with somebody, for better or worse. You might be trusting somebody that you shouldn't, because you have that proximity to them. And so I think that's been challenged in terms of how do we deem another individual trustworthy or not. And it takes, I guess, a really mature way of thinking to go, okay, my teammates are not turning their videos on, and that may be and we all know the really valid reasons, right? There's a basket of washing behind them that they really don't need anybody to be seeing.
Yes.
For all the really valid reasons. But that takes, I guess, the power of pause to actually stop and check your own assumptions and biases that have started to ping for you and go, this person is not trustworthy, they won't turn the video on, I can't see them.
Yes.
So I think that's what's changed, is that we've actually had to slow down some of our bias and the heuristics that go off in our brain. Now, for those people who had managers that didn't trust them or leaders that didn't trust them pre-pandemic and were requiring them, to show them their output the whole time, that still happens.
Yes.
That didn't change.
I don't think that's going to go away.
That didn't go away. And I think those leaders who were really comfortable working in a high-trust environment pre-pandemic, they flourished during the pandemic because people really knew that they had their back. They knew that they were trusted. They knew that, it was the outcome that mattered, not the output. So I think the way we measure trust and assess trust changed, but the notion of trust doesn't change, if that makes sense.
Yes. So trust is a cornerstone of building strong working relationship, which makes it easier to collaborate and make decisions and manage change. How would you measure the strength? First of all, how would you measure the strength of a relationship, a working relationship? What's the parameters? Like how would our listeners now, how would they actually measure whether they have a strong relationship with their sponsor or with their colleagues or not?
Well, okay, so trust comes into it.
Sure.
But I think, and it plays a really important role of it. But I think there's perhaps something a little bit more of, has this person got my back?
Yes.
And what would I do for this person? So it's this notion of reciprocity in terms of this person is here for me, and I am here for them.
Yes.
And I think if there was a metric, and I imagine there are scales out there, if there was a metric to sort of measure what are the situations where you have gone out of your way for somebody in your work team that had no payoff for yourself, that would have to tell you something about the strength of that working relationship, that you cared for their success as much as you cared for your success.
Yes.
Would have to be a metric of a strong working relationship.
Yeah. I think so. I think actually I was having a conversation the other day and I kind of made up my own measure.
Did you?
Jen.
What is it? Tell me.
Well, I listened to this lady. I can't even remember her name now, but she talks about human behavior. She's got the human lab behavior, and she talks about vitamins and medicine, which is two concepts here. So something is healthy, give it. If you're a healthy person, you have vitamins because you want to maintain and make it stronger. And if you're ill, you take medication. And so I took this concept and then I kind of worked out, if I want to measure a strength of a relationship or working relationship, I look at them, do they support me? So I think that's what you mentioned. Do they support me? And then the other axis is that, are they available? So it took me a couple of years to understand why somebody avoids my invitations or they always make themselves unavailable. Which is another reflection that there is no relationship in a place. So then when I looked at that, and I looked at if they're really high in support, and they show that in different ways, and they're usually available if you need help or feedback, or if it's high and high, then you maintain it and you inject vitamins. And because you don't take it for granted that a relationship is strong and it's going to say, stay strong. As you would know, work is a social system, and we negotiate our social contract every day. But if it's one of them is low, then you need to take drugs.
Yeah.
And the drugs meaning, what are the channels, what are the methods, what are the strategies for me to actually make this a better relationship?
Or if it's low, you amputate.
So,
right.
Some of us actually run away because thinking it's too hard.
Yeah.
But my
the payoff's not there.
Yeah. Well, it's too hard for me. But then my counsel to those people is that if you're going to work with those people on a regular basis, at least find a way to neutralize it rather than make it minus.
Yeah.
Then at least then you can have a rational discussion, based on respect. And as you mentioned, minimum reciprocity there, but let's just call it working reciprocity in there.
I think that brings up for me, though, and, the example that you had before of the person that wouldn't respond to your invitations, it brings up for me the notion of, or the importance of boundaries in professional relationships. And so if I'm going to add to that list of what you asked me, is this a person who respects my boundaries? And is this a person whose boundaries are well understood, or well communicated? So I know that I'm not going to violate those boundaries, but I can do as much as I can until where the boundary is for that person. And so I think that's probably an element that you would add to what makes for a really strong working relationship.
So you talked about in your book the axis of collaboration. I really like that. Can you just give us a summary of it?
Yeah, sure. So the axis of collaboration was a model that my business partner in Busting Silos, Melissa Dark, and I came up with. And what we were looking at was really, what are the dimensions that are really important when it comes to determining, are you going to collaborate with somebody? And I guess there's a presupposition there that in a time of continuing disruptive change, you don't have certainty. You can't possibly know it all. You won't have the solution with you. You actually do need to collaborate with others to continue moving forward. And so the two axes that we look at there are in terms of the degree of trust and the degree of familiarity.
Yeah.
So in recognizing that the quadrant, which is high trust and high familiarity, that's an environment where you go for broke, right? So there are very few limits in that form of collaboration. It's a really safe space to do it. The quadrant, which is low familiarity and low trust, again, that's a decision of, well, you probably wouldn't want to be doing work with them, and looking at, well, why are they not familiar and why don't you trust them? And some of them, there'll be reputations precede them, and that's influencing you.
Yes.
But others, it's because they've done you wrong in the past. What was really interesting, and I'm a real big fan of working out loud. And so when you
Yes.
have a model, take it out and stress test it. Michelle Redfern works in the space of diversity, and she's featured in chapter 7 in the book. She saw what we were talking about, and she went, heads up, you guys are creating something that is not going to be accommodating to diversity. Because if you have a group of, white male decision makers going, is this person familiar to us? And it's a person of another colour or of another gender or, any other dozens of ways that people become othered, then that model relegates them to do not collaborate with them.
Yeah.
And so we've had to now go back to it and look at it, what are the nuances or what are the things that we actually, when we teach it in our Busting Silos program, teaching it a little bit differently now to say, look, beware of, what are the reasons that you're saying you're not familiar with them? Is it because they're not like you, that it's a diversity issue?
It's a tricky business when you're trying to figure it out, and there's always going to be blind spots. But I think working it out loud or deconstructing it will help. There's always going to be a grey area somewhere, and by the time you uncover that grey area, new grey areas will appear, and that what makes it really interesting because you're dealing with the humans.
Oh, totally, Ali. And I think there's an element of do no harm, right?
Of course.
You don't want to be in a position that whatever clever model you've come up with, you put out there, is actually perpetuating further harm. So we were really appreciative of that conversation. It was great,
Yeah. Hi there. Thank you for listening to this podcast. To listen to other podcasts, check us out at the innergameofchange.com.au website. Yep, Jen, most interesting pieces in the book is about the mindset. And then you talked about the exploratory mindset versus the agile. I love it. It made me think. But I want to touch on, first of all, the exploratory one. We're talking about exploration inherently demonstrates that there's a potential, but it requires a lot of what I call intelligent patience. So how can we marry the two? How can we marry that we are now in uncertain times, in the VUCA times, and yet you're promoting the exploratory mindset? Is that because during uncertain times we allow that mental flexibility?
I think where this work came from, so this was Gillian Riley, who I did work with last year, and one of the things that we were both really curious about was this belief that we were in unprecedented times. How many times did you hear, this is unprecedented, this is unprecedented, this is unprecedented? And we went, actually, it's not. It's not. We have explorers all around us who are really, really familiar going into new space, either literally, as we were seeing last week with all the billionaires heading up into space, but geographically, in science, in domains, we've had people exploring the fringes since ever. The challenge then was, what could we take from those people to say, is this missing in our leadership teams? And it was. When we actually broke down what are the elements of people who are really good at exploring new domains, we don't see that in leadership teams, and indeed some of the more recent leadership models or approaches, so servant leadership and certainly agile leadership is, pivot or perish, right?
Yes.
It's very good at pivot. Now, an explorer wouldn't pivot. They persist. If the river gets, really turbulent, it's probably not a river, it's turbulent. If the water gets turbulent, they find a way to persist rather than turning around.
Choppy seas will not make me stop my voyage. Yeah.
Perfect. And I think that was one of the things that we sort of drew out was actually our leadership teams are probably not very good at exploring because, one, they're very low on somatic intelligence, so that actually understanding your body well enough to know what signals your body are telling you in this moment. So is it excitement? When I work with leaders on webinars and things like that, and one of the questions I ask them is, tell me, where do you hold anxiety and stress? And in the chat box, it'll be my jaw or my stomach or et cetera, et cetera. So you get a level of, they know when they're stressed and they're anxious. And then I say, so where does excitement sit in your body? And there's always this big space of, and so how do you know the difference between an idea that excites you or stresses you? Your body will know.
Yes.
But if you actually haven't done the work to get in touch with that, you're going to make slower decisions or perhaps poorer decisions because you're confusing the signals that are coming through.
Yes. And look, exploration needs, first of all, it's not for the faint-hearted. You need a level of, I am comfortable in some risk. But I think you really put it eloquently in the book that is actually exploration. No, it's persistence with prudence.
Yes.
And I really like it because there's always going to be somebody coming in there and saying, hey, Jen, I manage thousands of people and they all rely on my decisions. I'm not going to go and experiment and explore. And but so you underpin it by prudence. But exploration needs time and needs a level of persistence. However, our people nowadays in organizations, they're really craving for certainty. And so do we manage this gap by communicating?
Look, I think that helps in certain circumstances. And again, I'm going to be really circumspect with this because if we think we're plugging the gaps of people's need for certainty by communicate, what you're actually doing is amping the anxiety, right? If we poor communication, doesn't matter how much of it you have, will have the unintended consequence. So I think we've got to be really, really careful about when we think communication is the panacea to people wanting certainty, because it's particular types of communication that will do that. The opportunity to sit in conversation with the leader and sense make is really, really helpful. But putting out frequent, missives around here's the status won't actually do that to a workforce. I think the piece that is more useful, and this starts to circle back to our conversation on resilience, is the notion of distress tolerance, that if we can build a level of distress tolerance, then we get better with uncertainty. And you can't, and again, this is where these themes keep coming interweaving for me, because you can't build distress tolerance without a level of introspection, understanding how you process emotions, and compassion and the self-compassion.
Yes.
Right? Distress tolerance becomes much more comfortable if you are naturally self-compassionate. But if you're the type who is really good at judging yourself and being critical of yourself, distress tolerance will be unbearable.
Yeah, I worked with quite a lot of people. And as you would know, stress breeds stress.
Contagion.
And I want to shift to the agile mindset. I know that I think Lena Ross has contributed to this piece, and I've got a couple of comments on it. First of all, I think the conversation was around shift from failure aversion to failure seeking. And I actually look at it in the way that instead of failure seeking is actually just learning seeking. That's what we really do is, and I'm not too sure, I haven't really seen anything that completely 100% failed. It's usually partially failed. And so, and the other part is that becomes the learning. Overall, in all of those conversations that we've had so far, does the industry make a difference in terms of leading change?
Yeah, in terms of leading change, yes, I think it does. I think if there will be cultural norms in industries which impact your ability to lead change, but there will also be structural barriers in industries, and so I'm thinking about regulation. Those industries that are highly regulated often find it more difficult to lead change because they're constrained around what they can say and how they behave. So I do think that there are external factors that impact your ability to lead change in an organisation, and there are internal factors. There's history and legacy. Isn't that the biggest one? You could have two organisations within financial services with two very different legacies that will impact your ability to lead change. Yes. If we're looking at some of those mindset shifts, there are absolutely some of those mindset shifts that are easier and already well happening. People are on the far right continuum in, technology industry as opposed to insurance industry, right? So yes, I think it's a good question, and you've got to factor it in when you're thinking about how do you want to encourage them to lead change.
And I think the deciding factor nowadays is that who's going to be ahead is the organization that pays attention to how they manage the change. That will be the only, however big you are, at some stage you would need to be good at managing this particular change. I mean, look at the tech companies nowadays. They've become exceptionally well placed to manage changes, and it becomes part of their culture and the norm, living in their, what is it they call being comfortable in their discomfort.
With discomfort,
because the discomfort brings creativity, and that's how they encourage that. I'm going to share with you a story. It's not a story, but I can't remember the guy's name, but he was the coach and the mentor for the LinkedIn CEO, and he's an Argentinian thinker. And he shared in one of his lectures, the story goes like this, is that Jen, you and I are just walking in a forest, and all of a sudden a huge grizzly bear shows up, and then we look at each other and think, oh my God, we're going to have to do something. So you start to get ready to run, and here's me sitting down, changing my shoes and putting my runners on. And he's saying to me, hey, Ali, what are you doing? We need to run. There's a grizzly bear coming towards us. And I'll be saying, well, Jen, all I need to do is just run a little bit ahead of you, and the grizzly bear will catch you, because the bear will only catch one of us. All I need is just to be one step ahead of you. And so when I start thinking about that, the idea is that we're all going to be chased or by a pressure from the market, from stakeholders, from people. The organizations that will be slightly ahead will be the ones, they don't need to be far ahead, but they will be slightly ahead, the ones that will be managing the change effectively. And I think your book covers a lot of those aspects where if an organization is really serious about managing change, they need to look at all of those 33 topics, because I think it's the one place where you can find everything they need to think about in terms of change. Curiosity is one of them. And I think you mentioned type D and type I.
Yep.
You want to explain what that means?
Oh, okay, I'm going to have to get it right now without looking at the book. So type
I think the
D.
hint, the I is better.
I know the one I use is I is for inquisitive.
Yes.
So okay, that's how I try and remember the mnemonic on it. So type D, curiosity, is problem solving.
Yes.
So when you are curious for the sake of, you have a known problem and you're curious to you use your curiosity to solve that problem. Type I is the one that we don't tend to make a lot of time for, and that's the notion of just being inquisitive for the sake of fun. And, for me, it's kind of like the pleasure or pain motivation. We most often do things to get out of pain, whereas the type I curiosity is kind of aligned with pleasure. So think about when you go down the rabbit hole on YouTube, right? You start off watching one video because that's got the information that you needed to work out how to, fix a bike. But all of a sudden there's others coming up, and 3 hours later you've been watching videos on everything on YouTube,
Yes.
that you find really interesting and just took your interest. And that's I-type curiosity. So I think the challenge is I-type curiosity is quite inefficient, right? I just told you lost 3 hours on YouTube, whereas you only needed 15 minutes to watch what you had to do to work out what you needed to do.
Yeah.
But that 3 hours on YouTube might actually spark a whole new way of thinking or an awareness of a concept that hadn't even crossed your path before. And it's so how do we make time to have more space for I-type curiosity in our life?
Yeah, I think Google does that, Facebook does that, quite a few of them. And sometimes, you're actually talking, you have a self-talk, thinking, God, I need to get off, but which is an art by itself. And I agree, like the knowledge will be, you may not need the knowledge now, but at some stage it's going to surface up. There's a section about data and the role of data. And so you talked about data-driven decision-making. But also you throw in there something which I really was working with somebody maybe a couple of weeks ago, that when we roll out a change, we need to allow people time to adopt that change rather than, throw it at them on top of what they're actually doing, because you need time and space and to digest it. You throw in there the principle of Slack. So the role of the data is that you look at the data and then you decide data creates efficiency. Well, it's not really the data, it's actually...
It's the exploit versus exploratory strategy with your data.
It's actually the insight out of the data that will actually help you create that efficiency. But in your book, and I may have got it completely wrong, but I like what I got. It might be unintentional, but when we create the efficiency, we should not eliminate that Slack. We should use the Slack for the type I curiosity. Is that right?
Oh, look, that would be one use of it. I think the notion of organizational Slack is something that's been pretty well established as is important to innovation.
Yes.
So those organizations that have Slack often do more, the groundbreaking kind of innovation rather than the incremental innovation. But again, there's it takes courage as a leader to create Slack in your organization, because if you're measured on KPIs which are around, talk time and performance and speed to market,
no waste time,
those kind of things,
waste time.
There's no wasting time, and for me it also brings in this really, there's a piece of work by Daryl Connor around the difference between installation and benefits realization with change. And that a lot of the change we do focuses on installation. It's literally launch this change by this date, there you've got it, boom, Whereas benefits realization, there is always a lag after the installation date before you start to see the benefits realized.
Yes.
And if we are conscious around creating Slack in that space, then you're going to get better benefits out of it.
Yeah.
Because people do get to explore the change that you've brought in. And goodness, if people are exploring the change that you bring in, perhaps they're even making it better than you thought you designed it for.
Most of the time they actually do it. And in fact, they uncover a lot of gaps in there. Which is fine. I mean, that's part of the fun, is that no solution is a perfect solution. And there. Do you think in today's world we have got so much we're actually data rich and insight poor. Can the data be disorienting sometimes because you've got too much?
Absolutely. Back in my research days, there was a term coined by Professor Andrew Pettigrew, which is data asphyxiation. And it's what happens when, as a young researcher, you go out and you get so much data that you start to suffocate. You can't make sense of what you've got in front of you. And so, really important data strategy. I change around data and data. It upsets people. But a really important, data strategy in organizations is, what are you doing with your data? How are you actually converting it in a way that it is usable, that you can derive insights from it, that you can determine what is trash data to something that's really valuable data? There's a real power in the data scientists and the architects who can set up the frameworks which allow you not to asphyxiate with data.
The term is pretty dramatic, but I get it, and hence the craving for simplicity. I mean, you can have a big data team, and they can mine, they can do a lot of it. But when we present the information, it's going to have to be simple, easy to follow, and insightful. That will help me make good decisions going forward. And that is an art by itself. Last question, which is around reinforcement. So most of the time we talk about reinforcing change, but I think you brought something which is quite obvious, but I haven't really been able to articulate it myself. It's called the reinforcing stability. And you talk about stability anchors.
Yeah, so that's a concept that comes out of complexity science, which, I think can be really helpful in thinking about continuously changing environments. And rather than trying to, if you are, how to explain it? Okay, if you are trying to force patterns of stability and ways of being in a system, you create an inherent rigidity, which will be a threat to you.
Yeah.
You won't be able to change when you need to. And so complexity science and chaos theory talks about stability anchors, where we say that, these are 3 or 4 or 5 things in our organizational system that people can turn to for reassurance, that make sense to them, that are stable.
Yeah.
And so when I think about what does that mean in real life, that might be something like the values of the organization. Mm-hmm. So perhaps the products are changing all the time, but the values stay the same.
Yeah.
So it gives you that opportunity to when you're being tossed around by change in your organization, there's something that you can cling to that creates reprieve or just, makes sense at the time. So, stability anchors might be particular leaders in the organization. Maybe you've got those people in the organization, they're never going to leave. And that's a sense of reassurance with what's going on. So, maybe there's a practice or a ritual in the organization that every Friday you do something and you've always done that. And that's not going to change because that's what brings people together, a sense of belonging. And that's a way of stabilizing in a really uncertain time.
Great. We are coming to the end of the podcast. Sure. Jen, what is your final message to the leaders or the change practitioners?
Yeah, I think my final message is really around this notion of shift the dial. I want the reader of this book to recognize that it's not about creating big change personally. Any change is good. Start where you're at and just, if you move a little bit more to the right of the metaphorical dial,
yes,
then, that's a good thing. And so I want this to be, an empowering message for the readers that this is, there's 33 different areas that you could be looking to create a little bit more of change. But gee, if you just did 1% more change in each of those 33 domains, you'd have a cumulative effect that would be so powerful.
Powerful for you and powerful for the organization and the people you work with. Shift the dial. That sounds like a book title, Jen. coming your way. So you might want to consider that. I am grateful to have you with me, Jen, and spending the time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. How would people reach you?
Well, first, thank you so much for the conversation. They've been really, really rich questions and some great insights into that. So I really, really appreciate that, Ali. Thank you. In terms of reaching me, look, LinkedIn is always good. If you're going to connect with me, let me know that you heard the podcast. More than happy to connect, or my website, drjenfrahm.com. I'm a bit of a Twitter head, so there's usually a few conversations going on at Twitter at Jen Frahm. But yeah, few options there.
Fantastic. And we're going to put all the information in the Inner Game of Change podcast and the website, YouTube, and very shortly it will be on Instagram as well. It's been a pleasure, Jen. I'm grateful for your time. I hope to have you back again and we'll talk about another topic. But until then, I really appreciate your time. Stay well and stay safe.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast with Dr. Jen Frahm. To know more about Dr. Jen and this podcast, check the innergameofchange.com.au website. To receive more podcasts, simply subscribe. In our next podcast, we will meet with another change management specialist who will share their thoughts and ideas on change management, communication, and learning. Until then, stay well and stay safe.